In the middle of winter, a queen sewing by her window wished for a daughter with skin white as snow, lips red as blood, and hair black as ebony. As she looked at the snow, she pricked her finger, and 3 drops of blood fell. She dreamed of having a child of her own. The queen's wish came true. She had a beautiful daughter named Snow White, who was as fair as the queen had dreamed. But sadly, the queen died soon after her birth. The king remarried a woman who was beautiful but proud and jealous. She owned a magical mirror that she asked who the fairest in the land was. The mirror always told her she was the fairest. As Snow White grew, she became more beautiful each day. When she was 7, the mirror told the queen that Snow White was now the fairest. The queen grew jealous and angry. The queen ordered a huntsman to take Snow White into the forest and leave her there. She wanted Snow White gone forever. The huntsman couldn't harm Snow White, and instead left her alone in the woods, lost and scared. Snow White wandered through the forest. She found a tiny cottage and decided to rest there. Inside the cottage, everything was very small and very tidy. The cottage belonged to 7 dwarfs who found Snow White asleep when they came home. Amazed by her beauty, they agreed she could stay. Snow White promised to keep their home very clean and cook lovely food for them. Meanwhile, the queen learned from her mirror that Snow White was still alive and still the fairest. Furious, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She disguised herself as an old peddler. The disguised queen offered Snow White a poisoned red apple. Snow White took a bite and fell into a deep sleep. The queen believed she had finally won. The dwarfs found Snow White and were heartbroken, thinking she was dead. They placed her in a glass coffin in the woods. They couldn't bear to bury her. A prince who heard of Snow White's beauty found her and fell in love at first sight. He begged the dwarfs to let him take the coffin. As his servants carried the coffin, the piece of apple fell from Snow White's mouth. Snow White awoke and the prince was overjoyed. He asked her to marry him and she said yes. They prepared for a grand wedding. The evil queen, not knowing Snow White was alive, was invited to the wedding. When she saw Snow White, she realized her defeat and was filled with rage and despair. The queen left the wedding and moved far away from the kingdom. Snow White and the prince had a beautiful wedding, surrounded by all who loved them. The kingdom rejoiced at their happiness. Snow White and the prince lived happily ever after, always remembering the kindness of the 7 dwarfs. Snow White's kindness touched everyone's heart in the kingdom. She often visited the homes of the poor, sharing her happiness and wealth. The kingdom flourished like never before. Snow White and the prince visited the 7 dwarfs in their cottage. They brought gifts and shared tales of the castle life. The dwarfs were overjoyed to see Snow White happy. Together with the dwarfs, Snow White planted a magical garden. It had flowers that shone at night and fruit trees with jewels for fruits. It became known as the Enchanted Garden. Snow White started a school in the kingdom where children learned about kindness and bravery. She invited the dwarves to teach about friendship and courage. Every child wanted to be like Snow White and the dwarfs. The kingdom celebrated the Festival of Lights in honor of Snow White and the prince. Lanterns of every color lit the sky and people danced and sang. The dwarfs led the parade with Snow White and the prince. The prince transformed the queen's old mirror into a source of wisdom. It no longer answered who was the fairest but offered advice to those in need. It helped heal the kingdom's past wounds. Snow White and the prince often walked in the enchanted forest, now a place of beauty and peace. Magical creatures returned, living happily among the trees. The forest was a symbol of the kingdom's new harmony. Snow White and the prince had children who grew up learning their mother's kindness and their father's wisdom. They played with the dwarfs, learning the value of true friendship. The royal family was beloved by all. As years passed, Snow White's legacy of kindness shaped the kingdom. People came from far lands to witness the harmony and beauty. Snow White's story inspired songs and tales that would never be forgotten. Snow White and the prince lived long and happy lives, surrounded by love and friendship. Their story taught that kindness, courage, and love can conquer any darkness. And so, the kingdom lived in peace forever after.